My name is Abigail. I'm here with one of my best friends, Evie, and today I'm going to read to you Chapter 6 of Misty of Chincoteague, Pony Penning Day. Pony Penning Day always comes on the last Thursday in July. For weeks before, every member of the volunteer fire department is busy getting the grounds in readiness, and the boys are allowed to help. "I'll do your chores at home, Paul," offered Maureen. "So as you can see, the pony pens are good and stout." Paul spent long days at the pony penning grounds, yet he could not have told how or by whom the tents were rigged up. He hardly noticed when the chutes for the bronco busting were built. He didn't know who pounded the racetrack into condition. All he knew was that the pens for the wild ponies must be made fast. Once the Phantom was captured, she must not escape. Nothing else mattered. The night before the roundup, he and Maureen made last-minute plans in Phantom's stall. "First thing in the morning," Paul told Maureen, "you lay a clean bed of dried seagrass. Then fill the manger with plenty of marsh grass to make Phantom feel at home." "Oh, I will, Paul, and I've got some ear corn and some molasses to coax her appetite. And Grandma gave me a bunch of tiny new carrots and some rutabagas, and I've been saving up sugar until I have a little sack full." In the midst of their talk, Grandpa, looking as if he had a surprise, joined them. "I ain't rode on a roundup to Chincoteague for 2 years, he smiled, hiding one hand behind his back. "But I remember we allus had a chaw and goody after the ponies was rounded up, and afore we swimmed them across the channel. Here, Paul," he said with a strange huskiness, "here's a chocolate before you take it along." And he pressed the slightly squashed candy into Paul's hand. It was dark and still when Paul woke up the next morning. He lay quiet a moment, trying to gather his wits. Suddenly, he shot out of bed. Today was Pony Penning Day! His clothes lay on the chair beside his bed. Hurriedly, he pulled on his shirt and pants and thudded barefoot down to the kitchen, where Grandma stood over the stove, frying ham and making coffee for him as if he were a grown man. Evie. All right. He flung out his chest, sniffing the rich smells, bursting with excitement. Grandma glanced around proudly. "I picked the first ripe figs of the year for you," she exclaimed. "They're chock full of goodness. Now sit down, Paul, and eat a breakfast fit for a roundup man." Excuse me, Evie. Let me give you some more space. Paul sat on the edge of his chair. With one eye on the clock, he tried to eat the delicious figs and ham, but the food seemed to lump up in his throat. Luckily, Grandpa and Maureen came downstairs just then and helped clean his plate when Grandma was busy testing her cornbread in the oven with a long wisp of straw. "I gotta go now," Paul swallowed as he ran out the door. He mounted Watch Eyes, a dependable pony that Grandpa had never been able to sell because of his white eyes. Locking his bare feet around the pony's side, he jogged out of the yard. Maureen came running to see him off. "Whatever happens," Paul called back over his shoulder, "you be at Old Dominion Point at 10 o'clock on a fresh pony." "I'll be there, Paul." "And you, Paul," yelled Grandpa, "obey your leader, no matter what." Evie, are you listening? Day was breaking. A light golden mist came up out of the sea. It touched the prim white houses and the white picket fences with an unearthly light. Paul loped along slowly to save his mount's strength. He studied each house with a new interest. Here lived the woman who paid Maureen $3 for hoeing her potato patch. There lived Kim Horsepepper, the clam digger they had worked for. Mr. Horsepepper was riding out of his lane now, catching up with Paul. All along the road, men were turning out their gates. "Where do you reckon you'll do most good, bub?" taunted a jean-slapping of a man. On other days was an oyster man. He guffawed loudly, then winked at the rest of the group. Paul's hand tightened on the reins. "Reckon I'll do most good where the leader tells me to go," he said, blushing hotly. The day promised to be sultry. The marsh grass that usually billowed and waved stood motionless. The water of Chincoteague Channel glared like quicksilver. Now the cavalcade was thundering over a small bridge that linked Chincoteague Island to Little Piney Island. At the far end of the bridge, a scow with a rail fence around it stood at anchor. In spite of light talk, the faces of the men were drawn tight with excitement as they led their mounts onto the scow. The horses felt the excitement too. Their nostrils quivered and their ears swiveled this way and that, listening to the throb of the motor. Now the scow began to nose its way across the narrow channel. Paul watched the white hills of Chincoteague loom near. He watched the old lighthouse grow sharper and sharper against the sky. In a few minutes, the ride was over. The gangway was being lowered. The horses were clattering down, each man taking his own. All eyes were on Wild Maddox, the leader. Split in 3 bunches, Wild clipped out the directions loud and sharp. North, south, and east. Me and Kim and B-Boy will head east. Wimbro and Quillen goes north, and Harvey Rogers, south. We'll all meet at Tom's Point. At the first sound of Wild's steam whistle voice, the seabirds rose with a wild clatter. They're like scouts, Paul said to himself. They're going to warn the wild ponies that the enemy has landed. Gee up, shouted Wild as he whirled his horse and motioned Kim and Paul to follow. Paul touched his bare heels into Watch Eye's side. They were off. The boys' eyes were fastened on Wild Maddox. He and Kim Horsepepper were following their leader like the wake of a ship. As they rode on, Paul could feel the soft sand give way to hard meadowland, then to pine-laden trails. We're going over here now. There were no paths to follow, only openings to skin through, openings that led to water holes or to grazing grounds. The 3 thrashed through underbrush, jumped fallen trees, waded brackish pools and narrow winding streams. Suddenly, Paul saw Wild Maddox's horse rear into the air. We're over here. He heard him neigh loudly as a band of wild ponies darted into an open grazing stretch some 20 yards ahead, then vanished among the black tree trunks. The woods came alive with thundering hooves and frantic horse calls. Through bush and briar and bog and hard marshland, the wild ponies flew. Behind them galloped the 3 riders, whooping at the top of their lungs. For whole seconds at a time, the wild band would be swallowed up by the forest gloom. Then it would reappear far ahead, nothing but a flash of flying tails and manes. Suddenly, Wild Maddox was waving Paul to ride close. "A straggler," he shouted, pointing off to the left. "He went that way. Get him!" And with a burst of speed, Wild Maddox and Kim Horsepepper were after the band. Paul was alone. His face reddened with anger. They wanted to be rid of him. That's what they wanted. Sent after a straggler. He was not interested in rounding up a straggler that couldn't even keep up with the herd. He wanted the Phantom. Then Grandpa's words flashed across his mind. Obey your leader, no matter what. He wheeled his pony and headed blindly into the direction Wild had indicated. He rode deeper into the pine thicket, trying to avoid snapping twigs, yet watching ahead for the slightest motion of a leaf or bush. He'd show the men if it took him all day. His thin shirt clung to him damply, and his body was wet with sweat. A cobweb veiled itself across his face. With one hand, he tried to wipe it off, but suddenly he was almost unseated. Watch Eyes was dancing on his hind legs, his nose high in the air. Paul stared into the sun-dappled forest until his eyes burned in his head. At last, far away and deep in the shadows of the pines, he saw a blur of motion. With the distance that lay between them, it might have been anything. A deer, or even a squirrel. Whatever it was, he was after it. Watch Eyes plunged in. There was a kind of glory in pursuit that made Paul and the horse one. They were trailing nothing but swaying bushes. They were giving chase to a mirage. Always it moved on, showing itself only in the quivering leaves of moving shadows. What was that? In the clump of myrtle bushes just ahead? Paul reined on. He could scarcely breathe for the wild beating of his heart. There it was again, a silver flash. It looked like mist with the sun on it, and just beyond the mist, he caught sight of a long tail of mingled copper and silver. He gazed awestruck. "It could be the Phantom's tail," he breathed. It is, and the silver flash is not missed at all, but a brand new colt, too little to keep up with the band." The blood pounded at his ears. No wonder the Phantom was a straggler. No wonder she let herself be caught. "She's got a baby colt," he murmured. He glanced about him helplessly. If only he could think, how could he drive the Phantom and her colt to Tom's Point? Warily, he approached the myrtle thicket, then stopped as a hot wave of guilt swept over him. Phantom and her colt didn't want to be rounded up by men. He could set them free. No one had brought the Phantom in before. No one need ever know. Just then, the colt let out a high, frightened whinny. In that little second, Paul knew that he wanted more than anything in the world to keep the mother and the colt together. Shivers of joy raced up and down his spine. His breath came faster. He made a firm resolution. "I'll buy you both," he promised. But how far had he come? Was it 10 miles to Tom's Point, or 2? Would it be best to drive them down the beach or through the woods? As if in answer, a loud bugle rang through the woods. It was the Pied Piper, and unmistakably his voice came from the direction of Tom's Point. The Phantom pricked her ears. She wheeled around and almost collided with Watch Eyes in her haste to find the band. She wanted the Pied Piper for protection. Behind her trotted the foal, and all shining and clean with his newness. Paul laughed weakly. He was not driving the Phantom after all. She and her colt were leading him. They were leading him to Tom's Point. Thanks for tuning in.